This is the summary of Sister Wife, a memoir of faith, family, and finding freedom by Brown Woolley, summarized by Cellwave Audio and narrated by Callum. Disclaimer: this is an unofficial summary and analysis of Sister Wife by Brown Woolley. It is not the original book and is not affiliated with or authorized by the author or publisher. This work is intended to provide key insights, analysis, and commentary for educational and informational purposes only. All names, trademarks, and references to the original content remain the property of their respective owners. Every effort has been made to ensure that this use is fair under Section 107 of the Copyright Act. Readers are encouraged to purchase the original book from the author or publisher for the full experience and context. Introduction. Every family has its story, but few are as layered, complicated, and raw as this one. Sister Wives isn't just a book about polygamy or religion. It's a story about women, love, sacrifice, and the quiet battles fought behind closed doors. At its core, it's the journey of Brown Woolley, a woman who stepped into a life she believed was chosen for her, only to realize years later that her heart longed for something different. Her story unfolds in 40 chapters, each one peeling back another layer of what it meant to live as a wife among wives, as a mother raising children in a system that demanded much, and as a woman slowly discovering her worth. For years, Christine played her role, supporting her husband, holding her family together, navigating the complexities of sharing life with sister wives. But beneath the calm surface, questions grew louder. Was this really love? Was this truly the life she was meant to live? And most importantly, could she choose herself without losing everything else? Above all, this book is about finding freedom, not in the sense of leaving everything behind, but in rediscovering the strength to say, my happiness matters too. Chapter 1. It Finds Better. A little girl grew up in a home where faith shaped every corner of life. The walls carried whispers of prayers, the air heavy with rules that stretched far beyond her years. Her days were filled with the rhythm of obedience, quiet voices in church, lessons that stressed loyalty, and constant reminders that her role in the world had already been chosen for her. She was expected to step into a future mapped out long before she could even dream of one. But within her heart, questions stirred. They came softly at first, like a breeze slipping through a window left ajar. Why should love be shared? Why did happiness feel like something promised but never fully given? She wanted to believe that the sacrifices she witnessed around her meant something greater, but the unease refused to fade. Each smile she forced, each duty she performed, carried the weight of longing for something she couldn't name. There were moments of light, times when the closeness of family felt warm and unshakable. Laughter around a crowded table, hands joined in prayer, the comfort of knowing that she was part of something larger than herself. Those memories held beauty. Yet shadows followed quickly, reminding her that joy was rationed, affection divided, and freedom more dream than reality. It finds better. The phrase became a quiet promise in her mind. It wasn't rebellion, just a whisper of hope that life could offer more than endurance. The idea grew stronger whenever she saw small cracks in the system around her, sisters who swallowed their tears, mothers who smiled through heartbreak, children who pretended not to notice the tension in their homes. Something inside insisted that there must be another way, a gentler kind of love. A life not defined by silent suffering. The chapter unfolds with the weight of this duality, devotion on one side, yearning on the other. A young girl trained to submit also carried the seed of change deep within. Even when she tried to ignore it, the pull toward better was always there, waiting. And though she couldn't yet imagine where it would lead, the path had already begun, carved not by defiance but by an unshakable desire to live fully. Chapter 2. That's Not Us. There was a world outside, one filled with bright colors, unspoken freedoms, and choices that stretched wide like open sky. But in the small, closed circle where she lived, that world was considered dangerous. Stories drifted in about families who lived differently, people who chose only one partner, children who weren't raised under the strict codes of her faith. Whenever those stories reached the dinner table, the answer was always the same. That's not us. The phrase was a wall, invisible yet unbreakable. It separated her life from the lives she sometimes glimpsed through television screens, books, or the chatter of strangers in town. Each reminder drew a sharper line between them and us. She was told that their way was shallow, fleeting, selfish. Our way, she was assured, was righteous, eternal, the only path worth walking. Still, curiosity lingered. On trips outside her community, she noticed things, simple things that others seemed to take for granted. A girl laughing freely with her boyfriend in public. A mother who held her husband's hand as if the bond belonged only to them. Even the smallest moments carried a glow that tugged at her heart. She wondered why such ordinary gestures felt forbidden, why love had to be shared in fractions rather than whole. The phrase, "that's not us," became both a shield and a burden. It protected her from questioning too deeply, but it also gnawed at her spirit. She wanted to belong to something certain, but the more she repeated those words, the more hollow they sounded. Each denial sparked a new question. What if there was more than one way to live? What if happiness wasn't reserved only for those who sacrificed the most? Inside her home, loyalty was praised above all else. To question the system was to question love itself. And so she learned to smile, to nod, to echo the words back whenever doubt threatened to spill over. That's not us. It became a mantra drilled into her mind, a reminder that she was not meant to desire what others had. Yet deep down, the phrase began to shift. What if us could mean something new someday? What if she wasn't bound to the walls built by others? The thought was dangerous, but once planted, it refused to fade. The boundary between us and them blurred ever so slightly, hinting at a future she could barely imagine but already longed to touch. Chapter 3. I believed the world would end. Fear was woven into childhood like a second skin. The lessons were clear and constant. The world outside was wicked, and one day it would be destroyed. Every storm, every unsettling headline, every whisper of conflict was framed as a sign of the approaching end. For a child, those warnings carried weight heavier than any schoolbook. Each sunrise felt like it could be the last, each quiet night haunted by the thought of fire and judgment descending without warning. She learned to look for signs everywhere. A sudden clap of thunder might mean the prophecy was fulfilled. A flicker of unease in her parents' eyes could suggest something far more serious than they admitted aloud. Conversations in church layered the fear even deeper, voices low and urgent, speaking of chosen people, of trials that would test their loyalty, of rewards only for those who endured. It was a story designed to bind hearts tightly to the faith, but for a child it was also a nightmare that followed into dreams. The belief shaped her choices in ways she didn't fully grasp at the time. Why plan too far ahead if the end was coming soon? Why long for freedom if it meant stepping outside the protection of the chosen? She learned to silence her questions, to accept that sacrifice was the only way forward. But even as she recited the rules, her heart ached at the thought that joy itself seemed forbidden, as though happiness would mark her as unprepared for the trials to come. At times, the fear drove her closer to her community. Together they prayed, fasted, and prepared for a day that never seemed to arrive. Yet, in the quiet of her own thoughts, a small spark of defiance lit up. If the world were doomed, why did the sun rise so faithfully each morning? If destruction was certain, why did love, true, unbroken love, still feel like something worth chasing. Living under the shadow of an impending world's end made every small joy feel fleeting. A laugh, a stolen moment of peace, even the sound of music drifting from somewhere beyond her community, all of it carried an edge of guilt. But somewhere deep inside, another truth began to form. Perhaps the world wasn't ending at all. Perhaps it was only the world she had been told to believe in that was collapsing. Chapter 4. No girl wants a story like that. Every girl dreams of love, but the stories handed down in her world didn't sound like dreams at all. They were stories of sacrifice, of women sharing husbands, of learning to quiet jealousy until it no longer had a voice. Love was painted as endurance, as waiting for scraps of attention, as bending until nothing of yourself remained. She watched as women smiled through the ache, convincing themselves that devotion was enough to fill the hollow spaces. Mothers told their daughters to be strong, to remember that eternal rewards would outweigh the pain of sharing. But when a girl is young, her heart does not yearn for reward in some distant heaven. It yearns for closeness, for laughter with one person who belongs wholly to you, for a story that feels like it was written only for your name. The contrast was striking. In books and movies glimpsed outside her circle, romance was celebrated, two people choosing each other above all else. There were no quiet rivalries, no long nights waiting for a husband who would never truly be yours alone. Those stories were dismissed as false, shallow, even sinful. Yet, to a young girl sitting in her room, they shimmered like forbidden treasures. She longed to believe that love could be simple, unbroken, and whole. No girl wants a story like that. The phrase echoed like truth every time she watched another woman's smile falter when the husband's attention drifted elsewhere. Every time she saw tears wipe them quickly away so children wouldn't notice. Every time she felt her own chest tighten with the thought that this was supposed to be her future too. The stories she was told asked her to embrace sacrifice as beauty, but deep inside she knew there was nothing beautiful about love that left someone empty. No girl wanted to walk a path where happiness was rationed and affection divided like rations of bread. What she wanted was something entirely different. A steady love, a partner who stayed, a life that felt complete rather than fractured. And though she could not yet say it aloud, she carried that hope with her like a secret flame. It whispered that her story didn't have to match the ones she had been told. Chapter 5. Why are you here? The question hung in the air like smoke, sharp, unsettling, impossible to ignore. Why are you here? It was the kind of question that sliced straight through excuses and demanded truth. She had entered the room expecting warmth, maybe even belonging, but instead she was met with eyes that searched for weakness. In a world where loyalty defined worth, every choice to stay or leave carried weight. To remain was to declare allegiance, to walk in step with the rules that governed every corner of life. To leave was unthinkable. Betrayal, exile, the breaking of bonds too sacred to name. The question forced her to confront her own motives. Was she here because of faith, or because it was the only life she had ever known? Was she here because of love, or because love was defined for her before she had the chance to imagine it herself? The more she turned it over in her mind, the more she realized that here was not just a physical place. It was a system, a belief, a destiny carved by hands not her own. Others had faced the same question. She had seen it in their eyes, too. Women who carried quiet doubt but never dared to speak it. Children who wondered why their lives felt different from the families they met in the outside world. Yet the answer they gave was always the same. I'm here because I must be. But silence doesn't erase longing. Deep down, she knew the only honest answer was far more complicated. She was there because it was expected. After all, the thought of leaving felt terrifying because the weight of generations pressed heavily on her shoulders. Yet she was also there because some part of her still hoped that love could be found even in broken places, hoped that purpose would emerge from sacrifice, hoped that obedience might one day feel less like chains. The question lingered even after the moment passed, echoing in her thoughts long into the night. "Why are you here?" The words carried no easy answer, but hidden beneath the uncertainty was the beginning of courage, the realization that the question itself mattered more than any rehearsed reply. Chapter 6. I associated them with pain. There were objects, faces, and even songs that carried invisible weight. To most people, they were harmless. To her, they were reminders of moments that had left scars too deep to name. Every time she saw them, she felt a sting, as though the past had slipped quietly into the present. It began with the smallest things. A certain place in the house, the sound of footsteps in the hall, the tone of the voice was raised just slightly too high. Each one could send her spiraling back to memories she had tried hard to bury. What others might view as ordinary became, for her, a trigger of pain. And because those memories were tied to people she was supposed to honor and obey, the hurt twisted into something even heavier: guilt. She couldn't simply erase the association. Once pain had been stitched into a moment, it stayed there. Smiles seemed false, hugs felt heavy, words of comfort carried the sharp edge of memory. It was easier to pull back than to pretend that everything was fine. Distance became protection, though it left her lonelier than she wanted to admit. Still, she tried to find meaning in it. Perhaps, she thought, the pain was a test. Perhaps enduring it without complaint was proof of strength, proof of faith. That's what she had been taught. Suffering was not only expected, but noble. Yet in quiet moments, when no one was watching, the truth was harder to ignore. The pain did not make her stronger. It hollowed her out. She began to notice that others carried their own silent associations. The way one woman flinched when certain names were mentioned, the way another's smile froze when reminded of her past. Pain had marked them all, even if no one dared to speak of it openly. The realization struck her deeply. They were all pretending. They wrapped their hurt in silence, layering faith over it like plaster on a wall. But cracks showed, and once she saw them, she couldn't unsee them. For her, the objects and faces tied to pain became more than memories. They became warnings. A reminder that unspoken wounds don't fade with time. They grow louder, demanding to be faced, no matter how much silence tries to cover them. Chapter 7. She was hurt. The room had gone quiet, though no one said why. The air carried a heaviness, the kind that settled when pain could no longer be hidden. She sat there with her shoulders drawn in, eyes cast down, trying to pretend the world hadn't cracked open around her. But everyone could see it. She was hurt. It wasn't just a scrape on the surface. This wound reached deep, far past skin and bone, into the places where trust once lived. The hurt showed in the way she paused before speaking, as if words might betray her. It lingered in the way her laughter no longer rang as freely as it used to. She had become a quieter version of herself, moving carefully, as though even the smallest step might break her all over again. Those around her noticed but didn't always know what to do. Some offered prayers, others whispered encouragement, yet none of it seemed to touch the core of her pain. There is a kind of hurt that can't be smoothed over with gentle words, one that builds walls instead of bridges. That was the kind she carried. What made it worse was the silence. To admit pain in her world was to admit weakness, and weakness was frowned upon. She learned to nod, to say she was fine, even when her chest ached with the weight of everything left unsaid. But silence did not erase the truth. It only deepened it. And yet, hidden within her pain was something else, a flicker of strength. She was hurt, yes, but she was still standing. She still moved through her days, still showed up when it would have been easier to disappear. The hurt hadn't destroyed her. It had reshaped her. And though she didn't know it yet, those scars would one day speak louder than the pain ever had. Her story in that moment was not about the wound itself, but about survival. She was proof that even in a world where silence was demanded and strength was measured in endurance, the human spirit could keep going, hurt but not defeated, broken but not beyond healing. Chapter 8. My most magical moment. The day began like any other, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet somewhere between the rhythm of routine, something shifted, turning what seemed simple into a memory that would never fade. For her, it wasn't about grand gestures or fairy tale perfection. The magic came from something quieter, something that touched her heart in a way nothing else had before. It happened in a moment when she wasn't expecting it. Laughter filled the air, carried easily as if it had always belonged there. Sunlight streamed in through a window, casting patterns across the floor, and for a brief instant, time slowed. She felt safe, she felt seen, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel divided or hidden. It was as though the world had paused just to let her breathe. The magical part wasn't in the setting, but in the feeling. Her heart swelled with a kind of joy that asked for nothing in return. It was pure, untouched by fear, unburdened by duty. For once she wasn't weighed down by the expectations that always pressed so heavily. Instead, she was free. Free to feel, free to hope, free to believe that life could be more than rules and sacrifices. Others might have overlooked the moment. To anyone else, it might have seemed small, fleeting. But to her, it was proof that magic didn't need to be spectacular. It lived in the warmth of connection, in the gentle exchange of trust, in the rare glimpse of love that felt whole and unbroken. Later, when the ordinary days returned and the weight of responsibility settled back onto her shoulders, she carried that memory like a secret. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever pain threatened to swallow her, she held on to it. That moment reminded her that happiness wasn't just a story from somewhere else. It was possible, real, and within reach. Her most magical moment wasn't an escape from reality. It was a glimpse of what reality could be. And though it came and went in the blink of an eye, it planted a seed that would grow quietly inside her, guiding her toward a future she hadn't yet dared to imagine. Chapter 9. It was a bummer. Not every day carried lessons of hope. Some days fell flat, leaving disappointment heavy in the air. This one, in particular, was meant to be special, or at least different, a break from the usual weight of expectations. There had been hope for joy, for lightness, maybe even for something unforgettable. Instead, it ended with a sigh. It was a bummer. The moment itself wasn't catastrophic. No shouting, no heartbreak, no dramatic collapse. Just a slow unraveling of anticipation, like a balloon losing air. Promises had been made, promises of fun, of connection, of being seen and valued. But when the day played out, the promises never came alive. What was supposed to be meaningful turned into something hollow, another reminder that life rarely delivered the kind of magic she longed for. Disappointment has a way of lingering. She felt it in the silence that followed, in the awkward glances exchanged, in the way her own smile slipped away despite her best efforts to hold it in place. Around her, others tried to pretend it didn't matter. They laughed too loudly, changed the subject too quickly. But she couldn't shake the truth. This was not what she had been waiting for. It wasn't about the missed event itself. It was about the pattern. Too often, moments that should have been joyful left her with emptiness instead. Too often, she found herself hoping for something more, only to be reminded that expectation in her world was dangerous. To hope too much was to set yourself up for hurt. To believe in something better was to risk being crushed when it didn't come. And yet, buried within the disappointment was a spark of clarity. If joy couldn't be found in these hollow promises, then perhaps it had to be created elsewhere. Perhaps waiting for others to deliver happiness would always end in frustration. The bummer of that day became a quiet reminder. Fulfillment wasn't something to be handed down. It had to be claimed, piece by piece, in ways that felt real and lasting. The sigh she released at the end of the day wasn't just about what was lost. It was about what she still longed for, and what she was slowly beginning to realize she had to seek on her own. Chapter 10. The LDS Church's Bastard Children. In whispers and side glances, there was always talk of where they stood. The families in her world lived under a shadow cast by the larger church, the mainstream faith that had long since moved away from the practices her community still clung to. To those outside, they were seen as outsiders, even imposters, remnants of an old way that had been pushed into the margins. The phrase that lingered, sharp and cutting, was the bastard children of the LDS Church. It wasn't spoken with kindness. It marked them as unwanted, as a stain on the reputation of a faith that sought to appear modern and respectable. Their very existence was a reminder of history the church wanted to forget. For her, growing up with that label meant carrying an identity shaped by rejection. She belonged to a group that insisted it held the truest version of belief. Yet, to the broader world, they were nothing but a shameful reminder of a past best erased. This tension created a strange loneliness. They weren't fully part of the larger faith, and they weren't accepted by the rest of society either. They lived in between, tolerated by neither side. Children felt it most deeply. In school, there were questions, stares, and the occasional cruel joke. On the playground, whispers followed. They're different. They're not like us. Even at home, the adults reinforced the divide, warning the children that they would never be understood by outsiders. The world was against them, and so they must cling tighter to each other. But that constant reminder of rejection also planted seeds of doubt. If they were truly chosen, why were they treated like cast-offs? If their way was the right one, why did it leave them isolated and ashamed? The label, bastard children, was meant to wound, and it did. Yet it also revealed something deeper, the fragile line between belonging and exclusion. To grow up under it was to learn early that identity can be both weapon and shield, both burden and banner. And as she carried that identity forward, she began to wonder if being cast aside might not only be a curse, but also the beginning of a path toward freedom. Chapter 11. You have to meet her. It began with a spark of excitement in someone's voice, the kind that made heads turn. You have to meet her, they said, as though the introduction itself carried the promise of something life-changing. In a world where relationships were carefully woven together for faith, family, and survival, meeting someone new was never casual. It was a possibility. It was destiny waiting to be shaped. The anticipation grew before she even walked into the room. Whispers described her as kind, strong, maybe even the perfect fit for what the family needed. When she finally appeared, there was a hush, as though everyone wanted to see how this moment would unfold. Every gesture mattered, the way she smiled, the warmth in her eyes, the way she carried herself. For those watching, it was more than just a meeting between two people. It was the first page of a story that could change everything. But underneath the excitement, there was also tension. For those already bound by commitment, a new face meant a shift. Attention once divided would now stretch further. Bonds already strained would be tested again. To welcome someone new was both an act of faith and an act of sacrifice. And while everyone smiled and nodded, a quiet ache lingered, unspoken but heavy. For her, meeting this new woman was complicated. Part of her wanted to embrace the connection, to believe in the goodness others promised she would bring. Yet another part tightened, bracing against the familiar sting of sharing once more. It wasn't jealousy in its simplest form. It was the knowledge that love, once again, would not be whole. Still, there was no choice. In her world, introductions weren't about personal preference. They were about obedience, about believing that God's plan spoke louder than her own heart. So she smiled, she listened, she welcomed me. But deep down, she wondered what the cost would be this time. The words, "You have to meet her," echoed long after that day, not as an invitation but as a reminder. In this life, love wasn't always chosen. Sometimes it was given, and you had to find a way to live with it, even if it chipped away at pieces of yourself. Chapter 12. You'll have some great home. The promise sounded sweet, almost like a blessing. You'll have a great home. Words like that carried weight in her world. A home wasn't just walls and a roof. It was the measure of belonging, a symbol of God's favor, and the stage where love and sacrifice played out in everyday life. To be told she would have one was meant to bring comfort, to reassure her that her path was secure. But promises don't always match reality. In her mind, home conjured visions of safety and warmth, spaces where laughter rang out freely, where children played without fear, where a woman could rest her heart without questioning if she was enough. What she saw instead, too often, were homes full of unspoken tension, women smiling through exhaustion, children watching arguments they couldn't quite understand, husbands stretched thin between households. The foundation was there, but the piece was missing. Still, she wanted to believe. When she walked through unfinished rooms or looked at floor plans scribbled on paper, she imagined filling them with light and love. She pictured walls that would protect rather than confine, and a table where everyone gathered without rivalry. Hope clung to her like a shadow, fragile but determined. Yet with each passing day, reality pressed harder. A home wasn't just about what was promised, it was about who lived inside it. And if hearts were divided, if love was stretched too far, no amount of paint or furniture could fill the emptiness. Sometimes the very space meant to be a sanctuary became a stage for silent battles. The phrase, "you'll have some great home," lingered in her mind, not as comfort but as a challenge. What did it mean to truly have a home? Was it something handed down by others, or was it something you built for yourself, piece by fragile piece? Deep inside, she began to understand. The walls didn't make the home. The love inside did. And until she found a love that was whole and steady, no promise, no matter how well-intentioned, could make the emptiness disappear. Chapter 13. Just be present. The advice came often, spoken with gentle conviction. Just be present. It sounded simple enough, almost easy. But for her, presence was the hardest thing to give when her heart was stretched in too many directions. She would sit in a room filled with laughter and conversation, nodding and smiling at the right moments, yet her mind drifted elsewhere. Thoughts of what was missing, what was divided, what was quietly breaking beneath the surface kept tugging at her. Presence required her to quiet the ache inside, to push away the longing for something more than borrowed time. She noticed how others tried to master the same act. Wives who leaned in during conversations, children who clamored for attention, husbands who moved from one household to another, all of them trying to convince themselves that their presence, however fleeting, was enough. Yet the strain showed in the way eyes darted to the clock, in the way goodbyes came too quickly, in the way silences fell heavier than words. For her, being present often meant pretending she wasn't hurt when affection shifted away from her, pretending the moment was enough, even if it ended too soon, pretending that simply showing up could fill the gaps left by absence. But deep down, she knew presence without commitment was only half a gift. Still, there were times she managed it, times when she let the laughter of her children anchor her, when she let herself truly hear their voices and see their joy. In those moments, she understood the power of presence, the way it could slow time, the way it could soften the edges of her pain. But it was a fragile balance. To just be present required more than physical closeness. It required the heart to stay, even when it longed to run. And for her, that was a lesson she kept learning over and over again, that presence is both the hardest and most necessary act of love. Chapter 14. We have chosen you. The words landed with a weight she hadn't been ready for. We have chosen you. They were spoken of as though they carried honor, as though being chosen was the highest gift she could ever receive. Yet beneath the surface of the statement, she felt a shift, one that was more about obligation than freedom. To be chosen in her world wasn't about personal desire. It wasn't the kind of choosing that came from love freely given, or from a heart deciding where it wanted to belong. It was a choice made for her by others, wrapped in the language of destiny. Her worth was measured not in who she was, but in how she could fit into the life already built by someone else. At first, she tried to see it the way they wanted her to. She told herself it was a privilege, a sign that she had been found worthy. She tried to smile, to nod, to carry the mantle with grace. But deep inside, questions stirred. If she had truly been chosen, why didn't she feel joy? Why did her chest feel heavy, her future uncertain? Being chosen meant entering a life she had not designed, a role that demanded sacrifice from the very start. She knew it would mean sharing what she had always hoped would be hers alone. She knew it would mean silencing her own doubts to make room for faith. The choice wasn't hers to make. It was hers to endure. Yet there was another side to it, too. Being chosen meant she belonged somewhere, even if the belonging was complicated. It meant she was part of a story bigger than herself, a story passed down through generations, one that carried both faith and fracture. She could not deny the thread of pride that ran alongside the sorrow, the sense that somehow her life mattered to a plan she could not fully understand. Still, the words echoed long after they were spoken. We have chosen you. For some, they might have sounded like a blessing. For her, they were both a gift and a burden, a reminder that choice, in her world, was never truly her own. Chapter 15. Mojitos are delicious. The glass was cool against her fingers, beads of condensation running down to her hand as she lifted it. She took a sip, and the sharp sweetness of lime mixed with the bold burn of rum danced across her tongue. She almost laughed out loud. Mojitos are delicious, she thought, and for the first time in a long while she felt light. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about the moment. Music thumped softly in the background, conversations buzzed around her, and for once the weight of expectation didn't press so hard against her shoulders. She was simply a woman with a glass in her hand, tasting something new, something that belonged only to her. She leaned back in her chair, watching the people around her. Their laughter rose and fell in waves, and for the first time she wasn't on the outside looking in. She was part of it. She felt the corners of her mouth lift into a smile that didn't need to be forced. Another sip, colder this time, made her laugh. This is dangerous, she whispered to the friend beside her, who grinned knowingly. For a fleeting second, she wasn't a wife balancing unspoken rivalries, or a daughter trying to live up to an impossible faith. She was just a woman discovering joy in the simplest of things. She thought of all the rules, the lines she wasn't supposed to cross. A drink like this wouldn't ruin her soul. But in her world, even small indulgences carried judgment. She could almost hear the whispers already. She's straying. She's slipping. Yet sitting there, glass in hand, she didn't care. The mojito wasn't only sweet, it was freedom in a glass. Each sip reminded her that life could be playful, colorful, and hers. For once, she wasn't thinking about what she owed others. She was thinking about what it felt like to breathe without permission. As the night went on, the glass emptied, but the taste lingered. She carried it with her long after she left, the memory of a night when she let go, when she laughed without fear, when she allowed herself to taste something that felt like happiness. Chapter 16. It felt so real. The dream began softly, so ordinary that she almost didn't notice when reality slipped away. She was walking through a house that felt familiar, though she couldn't remember ever being there before. The walls were painted warm, the air filled with laughter, and every corner held a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Then she saw him. His eyes caught hers, steady and certain, and something inside her melted. He reached for her hand, and the touch was electric, warm, grounding, like it belonged. In that moment, all the ache she carried, all the divisions and silences, seemed to vanish. Here she was chosen. Not out of duty, not out of obedience, but out of love. Her chest tightened with a joy so sharp it hurt. This was what she had wanted all along, not to be divided, not to fight for fragments of affection, but to stand whole in someone's gaze. She leaned into him, listening to the softness of his voice, the promise in his words. She could almost believe that this was her life, her truth. But then the edges of the dream began to blur. The sound of his voice faded, the warmth of his hand loosened, and the golden light that surrounded them dimmed. She clung to him, desperate to hold on, whispering, "Don't go." Not yet. Her eyes flew open, the ceiling above her stark and plain. The room was cold, silent except for her own breathing. Reality returned like a weight pressing her down, heavy and merciless. The dream was gone. She lay there for a long time, staring into the darkness. Her hands still tingled where he had touched her. Her heart still raced as though she had truly been seen, truly been loved. And the strangest part was how real it had felt, more real than the life she woke up to each morning. As dawn crept through the window, she turned onto her side and pulled the blanket closer. She told herself it was only a dream, but the memory of it stayed, haunting her with its sweetness. Because sometimes the things that weren't real were the ones that felt truest of all. Chapter 17. We are just doing the best. The words were spoken with a tired kind of honesty. We are just doing the best we can. They weren't meant to be an excuse, only a reminder that survival often looked messy. Around the kitchen table, the air was thick with unspoken frustrations. Bills stacked in one corner, children's laughter spilling in from another room. And between it all, two adults trying to keep a fractured life stitched together. They weren't perfect. They snapped at each other sometimes, lost patience, and said things they regretted. But underneath it all was effort. Effort to keep going. An effort to hold a family that kept stretching wider and wider. She watched the way he rubbed his temples, the way weariness lined his face. He wanted to be everywhere at once, to meet every need, answer every question, soothe every wound. But he couldn't. And she, in her quiet way, carried her own exhaustion. The late nights, the meals thrown together, the children tucked in with half smiles because her heart wasn't always steady enough to give them more. We're just doing the best we can, she repeated softly, as if saying it aloud might ease the weight pressing on them both. There were days when their best felt far from enough. Days when the children noticed the silences, when jealousy burned hot between wives, when promises of faith felt more like chains than blessings. On those days, the phrase sounded hollow, but on others, when a child's laughter filled the house, when a meal brought everyone to the same table, when she caught him smiling across the room, it felt true. Their best wasn't perfect, but it was something. She held on to that thought. Maybe life wasn't about having it all figured out. Maybe it wasn't about flawless love or endless strength. Maybe it was simply about trying, showing up, holding on, even when the seams threatened to tear. As the night deepened and the children's laughter faded into sleep, she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. No, they weren't perfect. But in their own broken way, they were still here. And sometimes that was enough. Chapter 18. I put on my big girl pants. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were swollen from a night spent crying, but the world outside her room didn't care about that. Children still needed breakfast. Conversations still had to be had. The house wouldn't stop for her grief. So she took a deep breath, reached for her jeans, and whispered the words that had become her armor. Time to put on my big girl pants. It wasn't bravery in the grand, heroic sense. It was the quiet kind, the kind that meant swallowing tears so the children wouldn't worry, smiling when her chest felt hollow, and carrying the weight of choices she hadn't been allowed to make. Every day asked for more than she thought she had, and every day she found herself doing it anyway. She moved through the morning with practiced ease, pancakes on the skillet, dishes clattering in the sink, voices rising from the other room. She laughed at the right moments, brushed hair into neat braids, and made sure no one saw the heaviness hiding just beneath her skin. That was the role. Be steady, be present, be strong. But strength didn't mean she didn't ache. As she wiped the counter, her thoughts drifted to the life she had once imagined. A life where love wasn't divided, where she didn't have to share her heart with shadows, where she wasn't constantly stitching herself back together. That dream still lingered, fragile but stubborn. Still, she buttoned her blouse, fixed her hair, and squared her shoulders. She knew that survival didn't always look graceful. Sometimes it looked like showing up when you'd rather disappear. Sometimes it looked like pretending you were fine until the pretending became almost believable. By the time she walked out the door, no one would have guessed the battle she fought that morning. The tears were gone, replaced by a calm mask. She had done it again. She had pulled herself together, step by step, until she could stand. And as she walked forward, she whispered it again, almost like a prayer. Big girl pants on. Chapter 19. Bringing the boy to the yard. The yard had always been a place of gathering, a patch of green where children chased each other, where conversations drifted across the breeze, where secrets were whispered in corners, and laughter tangled with the sound of rustling leaves. That day, though, the air felt different. He walked in slowly, the boy everyone had been waiting to meet. Eyes turned, conversations hushed, and a ripple of curiosity passed through the space. Bringing him into the yard wasn't just a casual act, it meant something. In this world, every new face carried questions. Would he fit? Would he belong? What role would he play in the delicate web already stretched so thin? She watched him carefully, her heart caught between pride and worry. Part of her wanted him to feel welcome, to see joy on his face as he joined the others. The other part braced for judgment, for the quiet comparisons and whispered doubts that often followed someone new. The boy seemed at ease, though. He kicked a ball to one of the younger kids, his laughter breaking the stiffness in the air. Slowly, the tension began to melt. Conversations picked back up. Smiles returned. The yard felt alive again, as though his presence had added something it had been missing. But beneath the surface, she couldn't ignore the weight of it. Bringing him here was more than a simple introduction. It was a statement, a declaration that he mattered, that he was part of this tangled family, whether others were ready for it or not. Later, as the sun dipped low and the children scattered, she sat quietly, watching him from a distance. His laughter still echoed in her ears, and for a fleeting moment, her heart felt light. The yard, once heavy with expectation, now felt like a possibility. Yet she knew not everyone would see it that way. Some would smile at his face and question behind his back. Others would welcome him openly, but with boundaries she couldn't always protect him from. The boy didn't know that yet. To him, it was just a game in the yard, just another afternoon. But to her, it was the start of something larger, a shift, a test, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for a new kind of belonging. Chapter 20. Kody Brown, Lord of the Ring. The title was half a joke, half a truth, whispered among the wives. Lord of the Ring. It carried with it both reverence and irony, because the ring he wore wasn't just a symbol of marriage, it was a crown of authority. In every gathering, his presence filled the room before he even spoke. The children looked to him for approval, the wives waited for his decisions, and the rhythm of the family bent around his moods. Some days he was charming, spinning stories that pulled everyone in, making them feel like they were part of something extraordinary. On other days, his voice carried a sharpness that silenced the air, reminding everyone who stood at the center of it all. For her, watching him was complicated. There were moments when his energy pulled her in, when his confidence made her believe in the vision of a family knit together by faith and strength. He carried himself like a leader who believed deeply in his mission. But there were also moments when that same confidence looked like control, when his choices left others invisible, when his authority felt like a shadow that swallowed their voices whole. The name Lord of the Rings clung to him because he didn't just wear one ring. He wore many, each one tied to a promise made to a different woman. Those promises stretched across households, across children, across lives that often felt more like parallel tracks than one shared journey. And yet, in his own way, he believed he was holding it all together. The long talks, the firm rules, the way he demanded unity, attempted to balance a world that always threatened to spin out of control. To him, the title was proof of strength. To others, it was proof of power taken too far. That night, as she lay awake, the phrase played in her mind again. Lord of the Rings. It wasn't a name she had chosen for him, but it seemed to fit. Because in the center of their family's story, there he stood. Ruler, protector, and sometimes the very storm they were all trying to survive. Chapter 21. Just wait for the credits. The laughter faded as the movie ended, the screen going dark before the credits began to roll. Everyone started to rise from their seats, stretching, reaching for empty popcorn bowls, already shifting back to the rhythm of real life. But she stayed still, her eyes fixed on the rolling names. Just wait for the credits, she reminded herself. There was something about those moments at the end of a film, when the story was over but the music lingered. Names scrolled by, actors, directors, even people no one saw on the screen but who had shaped every detail of what she had just watched. To most, it was just filler, the boring part to skip. To her, it was the truth hiding in plain sight. Life wasn't so different from those credits. What everyone saw was the polished story, the smiles for the cameras, the family posed as one, the appearance of harmony. But beneath the surface, some names never made it into the spotlight. Silent sacrifices, unseen work, hidden pain, people carrying burdens without applause. She thought of her own name. It wasn't one the world would ever read on a screen, yet it was part of the story all the same. The meals she cooked, the tears she swallowed, the ways she stretched herself thin so that others could shine, none of it would be listed in neat white letters. But it was there, woven into the fabric of the family. The credits kept rolling and she let the music wash over her. Waiting for them was her way of remembering that even the people in the shadows mattered. Even if the audience left, even if no one stayed to see, their names were still there. Proof that they had been part of something. By the time the last line disappeared and the screen went black, she felt a quiet steadiness. Life might never give her applause. It might never write her name where the world could see it. But she knew, deep down, her part mattered. And sometimes that was enough. Chapter 22. I stopped eating my emotions. The kitchen had always been her refuge. On the hardest days, when words cut deep and loneliness pressed in, she found herself there, standing by the fridge, reaching for something sweet, salty, anything that could silence the storm inside her chest. Food had been her comfort, her distraction, the one thing she could control when everything else felt too big. But over time, the comfort faded, leaving only the heaviness behind. Each bite was a reminder that she wasn't dealing with the ache, she was burying it. The laughter in the next room didn't reach her, and the fullness in her stomach never touched the emptiness in her heart. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a half-empty carton of ice cream melting in front of her. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Staring at the spoon in her hand, she realized she wasn't feeding hunger at all. She was feeling sadness, frustration, and the weight of a life that often left her voiceless. That night, she pushed the spoon away. It wasn't easy after that. Each day brought its own temptations, the pull to numb instead of feel. But slowly she began to choose differently. Instead of reaching for food when the emotions swelled, she sat with them. She let herself cry, let herself feel the anger, the longing, the confusion. It hurt more at first, raw and sharp, but it was real. She started to walk more, to breathe deeper, to remind herself that she was stronger than the cravings that tried to pull her down. And with each small victory, she found pieces of herself she thought she had lost. Stopping wasn't about denying food, it was about finally refusing to deny herself. Her feelings mattered, her pain mattered. She didn't have to smother it anymore. One morning, standing in front of the mirror, she noticed her reflection looked a little different. Not because of her body, but because of her eyes. They were clearer, steadier, no longer clouded by the shame of secrets hidden in the kitchen. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was feeding herself something real. Courage. Chapter 23. You're really gonna do it. The words hung in the air like both a question and a challenge. You're really gonna do it? She had been circling this decision for weeks, maybe months, weighing every possible outcome. There had been nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had the courage to follow through. And now, with her plan out in the open, there was no more hiding. The person standing across from her wasn't mocking, just surprised. Still, the disbelief stung. It made her wonder if people had already decided who she was supposed to be, if they thought she'd never be capable of stepping outside the lines drawn for her. Her voice trembled as she answered, but her eyes were steady. Yes, I'm really going to do it. It wasn't a grand announcement. She wasn't marching into battle or standing at a podium. It was quieter than that, smaller, but no less powerful. Saying it aloud was an act of defiance against all the years she had swallowed her dreams, all the times she had settled because it was easier to go along than to resist. Her heart pounded as if trying to escape her chest. She knew the risk. Every choice had consequences, and this one would shake the ground beneath her family. But she also knew the cost of silence. To stay still would mean losing more of herself, piece by piece, until nothing remained. The other person studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly as if realizing she wasn't bluffing. The weight of that acknowledgement both scared her and set her free. When she walked away from that conversation, her legs felt shaky, but there was a strange lightness in her chest. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel trapped by someone else's story. Whatever came next, it would be hers. Chapter 24. You just love people. It was something people often told her. You just love people. The words sounded simple, almost casual, but they carried more weight than most realized. Loving people had never been optional for her. It was who she was. Even when it hurt, even when it left her vulnerable, she couldn't stop herself from caring. She opened her door, opened her arms, opened her heart, sometimes wider than she should have. And though it often left her drained, it also gave her life. She remembered the countless faces that had passed through her world, the shy child who clung to her hand, the neighbor who came by in tears, the sister-wife who needed comfort after a harsh word. She gave to them all, pouring out pieces of herself as if she had an endless well inside. Sometimes she wondered if that was why she felt so empty at night. Some people misunderstood her kindness, mistaking it for weakness or naivety. They thought loving so freely meant she didn't see the flaws, the betrayals, the sharp edges. But she did. She saw them all. She just chose not to close herself off because of them. Still, the cost was heavy. There were nights when she cried quietly, realizing she had given more than she could afford, and yet, the very next morning, she would do it again. Because deep down, she believed that loving people was never wasted, even if it wasn't returned. "You just love people," someone said again one afternoon, this time with admiration rather than judgment. She smiled faintly, though her eyes carried the weariness of someone who knew the price. It wasn't easy, loving people in a world that often rewarded selfishness, but it was her way of surviving, her way of holding on to hope. Even when love was complicated, even when it was messy, it was still the one thing she could give without asking for anything back. And in the quiet moments, she clung to the belief that love, imperfect and relentless, was what made life worth bearing at all. Chapter 25. Don't make jokes with one. The moment started lightly, just laughter bubbling between conversations, but it shifted quickly. What seemed like a harmless comment landed harder than expected, cutting through the room like a blade. The smile faded, the air thickened, and everyone knew. This was not someone you joked with. Not about this. Not today. It was always tricky, knowing where the invisible lines were. In such a tangled family, each person carried their own sensitivities, their own wounds. Some jokes bounced off easily, turning into shared laughter that stitched them closer together. Others pressed against scars too tender to touch, and suddenly what was meant to be light-hearted became a reminder of deeper fractures. She sat quietly, watching the tension unfold. The person on the receiving end of the joke stiffened, their eyes narrowing as if to say, "You crossed the line." The joker backpedaled, insisting it was all in good fun. But the damage was already done. Moments like these revealed how fragile their balance really was. One word too sharp, one laugh at the wrong expense, and the thin thread of harmony snapped. It wasn't about the joke itself. It was about everything that came before it, the history, the rivalry, the unspoken resentments. Later, when the house had quieted, she replayed the scene in her head. She thought about how easy it was to misunderstand one another, how humor could be both a bridge and a weapon. In a family already stretched so thin, there wasn't much room for careless words. She made a note to herself then. Be careful. Not every joke lightens the load. Some jokes only remind people how heavy it already feels. And in that realization, she understood something deeper. Sometimes silence was kinder than laughter, and sometimes respect was the only language strong enough to keep the peace. Chapter 27. Just be nice to each other. It sounded so simple, childlike even. Just be nice to each other. But inside that home where so many hearts and histories collided, it was anything but easy. Arguments often started small. A glance held too long, a word said too sharply, a misunderstanding that festered in silence until it became something larger than it ever needed to be. The house carried those tensions like echoes, bouncing from room to room, reminding everyone that peace was fragile. She found herself wishing over and over that kindness could be the rule instead of the exception. Was it really too much to ask? To smile instead of glare, to listen instead of dismiss, to choose softness instead of sharpening every disagreement into a weapon? Children, she noticed, seemed to understand it better than the adults. They fought and made up in the same breath, forgiving before the sting of hurt even had time to settle. Watching them, she often wondered why grown-ups struggled so much to do the same. But grown-ups carried pride, old wounds, expectations that weighed heavier than forgiveness. And so, kindness became something they had to remind themselves to practice, instead of something that came naturally. One evening, after another round of sharp words, She gathered the kids close and spoke the lesson aloud. Just be nice to each other. Their little heads nodded, their eyes wide and serious. In that moment, she hoped they understood more than the adults in the room did, that life didn't have to be constant competition or comparison. Later, lying in bed, the words echoed in her own heart. Maybe the reminder wasn't just for them. Maybe it was for all of them, herself included. Because sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to live by. And sometimes survival in a family as tangled as theirs could really come down to this. Just be nice to each other. Chapter 28. Endure through the end. The phrase was one she had heard 1,000 times. Endure through the end. In sermons, in whispered encouragement, even in her own thoughts when life felt too heavy. It was meant to inspire perseverance, a reminder that strength wasn't about speed, but about lasting until the very last step. But enduring was hard when every day felt like a trial of patience. There were mornings she woke up already tired, her spirit worn before the sun had fully risen. The endless balancing act, sharing love, sharing time, sharing space, pulled at her until she wondered how much more she could take. Still, she pressed on. Not with grand gestures, not with blazing heroics, but with small acts that most never notice. Waking up early to prepare a meal, biting her tongue instead of sparking an argument, smiling even when her heart ached. These little choices became her endurance. There were nights she cried quietly, whispering prayers into the darkness. Give me strength to hold on. Give me patience to last. And though the answers never came in thunder or miracles, somehow each morning she rose again. Maybe that was the answer. Enduring didn't mean life stopped hurting. It didn't mean she didn't long for freedom or change. It meant she kept going, one breath at a time, believing that even if the road was steep and lonely, she was still moving forward. She thought of those who had endured before her, the women in stories, in scripture, in her own family's history. They, too, had faced walls of despair and still carried on. She carried them with her, reminding herself she wasn't alone in this test of time. As the days blurred into weeks and weeks into years, the phrase grew heavier but also truer. Enduring wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was survival. And sometimes survival was enough. When she looked at her children's faces, at the future still unfolding before them, she whispered the words once more, not just for herself, but for them. Endure through the end. Chapter 29. I could move here. The air felt different in this place, lighter somehow, easier to breathe. As she stood taking it in, the thought slipped out almost without warning. I could move here. It wasn't just the scenery, though. The open sky and quiet streets offered a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. It was the sense of possibility, the whisper that maybe life didn't always have to feel so crowded, so complicated, so heavy. For a moment she imagined what it would be like, waking up without tension pressing against her chest, walking into her kitchen without worrying about who might be upset or who might feel ignored. A life that was hers alone, without the constant negotiations and sacrifices that had come to define her days. The thought scared her because it felt like betrayal to even picture it. But it also thrilled her because deep down she knew it was more than just a daydream. It was a glimpse of freedom. She let herself wander down quiet streets, imagining a house with space just for her, with walls that echoed only her laughter, her voice. A place where she could choose peace instead of always being forced to fight for it. But then reality tugged at her sleeve. Moving wasn't simple. There were children, commitments, bonds that still held even if they were fraying. To leave would mean tearing apart more than just her own life. And yet, the thought wouldn't let go. I could move here. It lingered like the first spark of something waiting to catch fire, small but impossible to ignore. By the time she left, She carried the place inside her. Not just the streets or the open sky, but the reminder that there were other ways to live, that she wasn't bound forever to one story. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, someday, she really could move here. Chapter 30. I just need my daddy. The words came out so soft they almost disappeared. I just need my daddy. It wasn't about possessions or status or even comfort. It was about something far simpler. The steady presence of a father. Someone to lean on. Someone whose voice could make the noise of the world quiet down. Someone who could make her feel safe when everything else felt unsteady. In that moment, all the layers of adulthood peeled back. She wasn't a mother juggling responsibilities, or a wife navigating complexities, or a woman trying to hold her own in a shifting family. She was just a daughter, longing for the kind of security only a father's arms could bring. Memories rose, unbidden. Childhood evenings when his footsteps in the hallway meant the day was complete. The way his laugh could fill a room, or how his silence could speak more than any lecture. He hadn't always been perfect, but he had been hers. And sometimes, when the weight of everything grew unbearable, she wished she could go back, just for a little while, to when his presence made the world feel less frightening. But life had moved on, and fathers weren't always there to run to anymore. Some had aged, some had changed, some had left. That absence made the longing sharper, almost like a wound that never fully healed. Still, the need for him lingered. It was less about him fixing everything and more about knowing she wasn't alone in the fight. She didn't want advice or solutions or even words. She just wanted the reassurance of being someone's child again, someone protected. Whispering it aloud, I just need my daddy, wasn't a weakness. It was true. A reminder that even the strongest hearts still ache for shelter. Even grown women sometimes long for the one person who once made the world feel safe. Chapter 31. You are not allowed in my space. Boundaries were hard to keep in a life where everything felt shared. Time, love, responsibilities, even silence. But there came a point when she had to draw a line, and she drew it with trembling certainty. You are not allowed in my space. It wasn't about shutting people out, it was about protecting the fragile parts of herself that were still hers. Too often, her feelings had been stepped on, her needs brushed aside, her privacy treated like something negotiable. She smiled through it, kept the peace, let things slide. Until one day she realized there was nothing left that was truly her own. That's when she knew. Something had to change. Her space wasn't just physical, though the room she retreated to mattered. It was emotional, spiritual, a small, sacred place inside her that no one else had the right to invade. Not with criticism, not with manipulation, not with careless words that left bruises no one could see. When she finally spoke it aloud, it startled even her. The firmness in her voice didn't sound like the woman who often bit her tongue. It sounded like someone who had rediscovered her strength. The reaction wasn't easy. Some pushed back, offended by her refusal to bend. Others tried to guilt her, reminding her of all the sacrifices she was supposed to make. But she stood her ground, even when her heart raced and her hands shook. Because the truth was clear. If she didn't protect her space, no one else would. And without it, she would lose herself completely. Later that night, as she sat quietly in the room that finally felt like her own, she let out a long breath. For the first time in a long while, the air around her felt safe. Her space was hers, and she was learning that saying no wasn't selfish, it was survival. Chapter 32. What did the nanny do? The question circled through the house like a rumor. What did the nanny do? It was whispered in the kitchen, murmured in the hallway, and asked with curiosity and suspicion tangled together. On the surface, it seemed innocent, just a question about someone hired to help. But beneath it, the words carried sharper edges. Every shared household had its rhythms, its unspoken rules. Outsiders rarely understood them, and when someone new entered, even in the simplest role, it stirred the balance. The nanny wasn't just an extra set of hands. She was another presence, another set of eyes, another person whose actions, or mistakes, were magnified under watchful gazes. Some people wondered if she had overstepped, doing more than she should have, saying something she shouldn't. Others thought the unease wasn't about her at all, but about what she represented. Intrusion, change, the uncomfortable reminder that help was needed in the first place. To the children, the nanny was just part of their world, another adult who tied shoelaces, poured juice, listened to stories. To the adults, though, she was something more complicated, a mirror that reflected insecurities they didn't want to see. Was she more patient? Was she doing things better? Was she in some way replacing them? The question, what did the nanny do, was less about her actions and more about their fears. The truth was, the nanny did what she was asked to do. She cared. She filled gaps where she could. But in a family stretched thin, even simple acts of kindness could be twisted, misunderstood, or seen as stepping into spaces that weren't hers to claim. By the end of it, no one had a clear answer. Maybe she hadn't done anything wrong at all. Maybe the real issue was that in a house already crowded with emotions and expectations, there wasn't much room for anyone else. The question faded, but the tension it stirred lingered like smoke after a fire, reminding everyone that sometimes what unsettled people most wasn't what someone did, but the fears they carried about what someone might do. Chapter 33. You already know what. The conversation didn't need to be spelled out. The moment the words hung in the air, you already know what, the silence between them filled with meaning. There was no need for explanation. The looks, the pauses, the shared history, all of it carried the weight of what wasn't said. Everyone in the room understood, even if no one dared to put it into sentences. It was a phrase that carried both accusation and exhaustion. It meant, we've had this talk before. It meant you know the truth, even if you don't want to face it. It meant I won't keep repeating myself to someone who refuses to hear. For her, the words cut deep because she did know. She knew the cracks in their marriage, the unspoken rivalries between sister wives, the little betrayals that built up into walls. She knew the distance that grew wider with each passing year and the way affection had shifted unevenly from one person to another. But knowing wasn't the same as admitting. Knowing meant carrying the burden silently, pretending for the sake of children, for the sake of appearances, for the sake of a faith that demanded endurance. So when the words, "You already know what," landed, they weren't a revelation. They were a reminder, a mirror held up to a truth she had been avoiding. Her chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to insist she didn't understand, that things weren't as clear as he made them sound. But she couldn't, because deep down she did understand. The ache in her heart proved it. The phrase lingered after the conversation ended, echoing long after the voices had gone quiet. And in the stillness, she admitted it to herself. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones you don't need explained because you already know them too well. Chapter 34. I had no regrets. Looking back, she realized the choices she made had cost her dearly. Comfort, stability, even relationships that once defined her. But when she measured those losses against the weight she carried before, her heart settled on one truth. I had no regrets. Every decision had been born out of survival, out of a quiet fight to reclaim her own happiness. People questioned her, judged her, and even turned their backs. Some whispered that she had given up too easily, that she should have endured longer, bent further, sacrificed more. But they weren't the ones living her days. They weren't the ones lying awake at night, aching in silence. She thought of the years she had stayed, convincing herself that patience would fix what was broken, that endurance would be enough to heal cracks in trust. She remembered the laughter she forced, the tears she hid, the way she molded herself smaller and smaller so others could take up all the space. Leaving, or choosing differently, wasn't weakness. It was a strength. It was the first time she had lifted her own needs high enough to matter. And though it came with pain, it also came with freedom. No regrets didn't mean no sadness. There were memories she cherished, bonds she wished had stayed intact, futures she once dreamed of that would never come to pass. But regret would have meant she doubted her right to peace, her right to choose joy. She didn't, not anymore. The past was tangled, messy, sometimes painful to revisit. But standing where she was now, breathing air that felt lighter, living days that finally belonged to her, she knew she wouldn't go back. Regret was for those who wished they had chosen differently. She didn't. Her only wish was that she had found her strength sooner. Chapter 35. It's about time. The words came with a mix of relief and frustration. It's about time. They weren't shouted, just breathed out, like a long-held sigh finally released. For so long she had waited, for change, for acknowledgement, for something to shift in a world where she often felt invisible. Each day she told herself to be patient, to hold on, to believe that eventually things would fall into place. But patience, when stretched too thin, starts to feel like a cage. And then finally, something happened. A decision was made, a truth admitted, a door opened. Small as it was, it felt monumental because it proved what she had known all along. Change was possible. It didn't erase the years of waiting, the tears she had swallowed down, or the strength it had taken to endure. But it marked the beginning of something she had been craving, movement forward. She thought of all the times she had been told to wait, to stay quiet, to let things run their course. Waiting had been her constant companion, and yet, when this moment came, she couldn't stop herself from thinking of everything she had lost in the waiting. Still, the relief outweighed the bitterness. It's about time to become less about frustration and more about possibility. Time hadn't been wasted if it led her here, to a place where she could finally breathe differently, hope differently, live differently. In her heart, she whispered gratitude for the strength it took to survive the waiting, for the courage it took not to give up, and for the moment that proved she had been right to hold on. Because when the shift finally came, she knew this was the beginning of a chapter she had been writing in her dreams for years. Chapter 36. I have COVID. The words felt heavy as they left her lips. I have COVID. It wasn't just the illness itself that shook her. It was everything the diagnosis carried, the fear, the isolation, the weight of responsibility in a family where closeness was unavoidable. For years, sickness had always been something that passed through the house like an unwelcome guest. But this was different. This time, the stakes were higher. Her body ached, her breath felt shallow, and the fever burned hot. But it was the silence around her that hurt most. Rooms that once buzzed with conversation now felt distant. The air seemed thick with suspicion, with worry, with the sharp reminder of how fragile they all were. Quarantine brought a strange stillness. For someone used to living life in constant motion, sharing, tending, mediating, the forced solitude was jarring. She was left alone with her thoughts, and they grew louder in the quiet. Doubts crept in. Who would care for the children if she grew worse? Who would hold the household together when she could not even rise from bed? But in that stillness there was also clarity. She saw how much of herself she had poured into everyone else, how little she had kept for her own healing. For the first time in a long while, she was forced to pause, to let others step in, to allow herself to simply rest. Fear lingered, of course, fear of how long the sickness would last, fear of what it could take away. Yet within the fear came an unshakable reminder. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and far too precious to keep postponing her own happiness. When her body finally began to recover, she carried that truth with her. The illness had weakened her physically, but it had sharpened her vision. She couldn't keep waiting for the perfect moment to claim joy, to set boundaries, to choose peace, because tomorrow was never guaranteed. Chapter 37. I lost my brain completely. It started small, forgetting where she had left her keys, walking into a room with no memory of why she went there. At first, she laughed it off, brushing it aside as stress or exhaustion. But then the lapses grew and the laughter gave way to panic. I lost my brain completely, she admitted one day, the words slipping out with a sting of truth. Her mind had always been her anchor, the tool she relied on to keep order in a life full of chaos. She prided herself on remembering every detail, every schedule, every child's need before they even spoke it aloud. So when her thoughts began to scatter, it felt like the ground beneath her was breaking apart. Some days were worse than others. She'd forget conversations that had just happened, misplace important things, stumble through tasks that once came naturally. The fog in her head was relentless, and no amount of lists or reminders could fully clear it away. The frustration cut deep. She was used to being dependable, the one who caught the things others missed. Now she was the one being reminded, the one double-checking herself, the one holding back tears when her memory slipped at the wrong time. And beneath the frustration sat fear, fear that the stress had pushed her too far, that the cracks in her mind would never fully mend, fear that she wasn't just tired but broken. But in those vulnerable moments, something unexpected happened. The people around her stepped in. They repeated things without rolling their eyes, helped her find what she misplaced, and carried the weight when her brain couldn't. She hated needing the help, but slowly she realized it didn't make her weak. It made her human. The fog didn't vanish overnight, but she learned to meet it with patience instead of anger. Losing pieces of her sharpness didn't erase her worth. And in time, she discovered something even more important. Sometimes losing control was the very thing that taught her how to accept grace. Chapter 38. You dressed really weird. The comment came out casually, almost as a joke. You dressed really weird. But words like that rarely landed lightly. She could still remember the clothes, bright colors, layered skirts, styles that didn't quite fit into the world outside her community. Growing up, that was normal. It wasn't until she stepped beyond those familiar circles that she realized how much people noticed, how quickly they judged. The sting of those words wasn't just about fabric and fashion. It was about being marked as different, as other. Every odd glance in a store, every sideways smile at school, every whisper carried the same message. You don't belong. At the time, she wore the clothes because that's what her family expected, what her faith encouraged, what tradition demanded. Each outfit carried with it an unspoken rule about modesty, identity, obedience. And though she didn't always love it, she accepted it because acceptance seemed easier than rebellion. But the older she grew, the more the clothes felt like a costume, one that covered up her real self. She longed for freedom, the freedom to wear jeans without shame, to try on dresses that didn't reach her ankles, to step into a world where she could choose what she put on her body without it being a reflection of her worth. Hearing you dressed really weird as an adult was almost funny, but it still tugged at that younger version of herself, the one who just wanted to fit in, to blend in instead of always standing out. Over time, she learned to see her past wardrobe differently. Yes, it marked her, sometimes painfully, but it also reminded her of how far she had come, from following rules without question to choosing her own path, from dressing for others to dressing for herself. The clothes had once been a cage. Now they were just memories, threads she had long since outgrown. Chapter 39. I wanted just the man for me. From the very beginning, her heart longed for something simple yet profound. Just the man for me. Not a perfect man, not the man everyone else wanted, not even the man who checked all the boxes on paper, but the one whose presence felt like home. She thought about love the way some people thought about breath. It had to be natural, effortless, a rhythm that came without forcing. She wasn't looking for wealth or grand gestures, though those might have been nice. What she craved was belonging. A love that didn't demand she shrink herself, hide her voice, or carry all the weight alone. But life had taken her through a different path. Instead of just the man for me, she found herself in a world where love was shared, split, stretched thin across too many hearts. A world where compromise was constant and her desires were often tucked into silence. In the quiet corners of her soul, though, the longing remained. She dreamed of conversations with no interruptions, of affection that wasn't divided, of laughter that belonged to just two people and no one else. It wasn't greed. It was yearning for wholeness. Sometimes she wondered if that dream made her ungrateful, if wanting just the man for me meant she wasn't strong enough, spiritual enough, or patient enough. But the truth was simpler. She was human, and humans were built to want love that felt complete. Even as she lived the life laid before her, the desire never faded. It lingered like a song she couldn't forget, reminding her that deep down all she ever wanted was not abundance, not perfection, but one steady, undivided heart. Chapter 40. She started to cry. At first, her voice held steady. She spoke calmly, carefully, like she had practiced the words 100 times in her mind. But somewhere between what she meant to say and what she actually said, the weight became too heavy. Her throat tightened, her words broke apart, and then it happened. She started to cry. It wasn't the quiet, delicate kind of crying. It was the kind that came suddenly, uninvited, like a storm rolling in faster than anyone expected. Her shoulders shook, her hands covered her face, and all the feelings she had been holding back finally spilled out. No one moved at first. The room froze, caught between shock and discomfort. She had been strong for so long, holding herself together when it seemed impossible. To see her unravel even for a moment was jarring. The tears weren't only about the moment at hand. They were about years of silence, about sacrifices no one noticed, about exhaustion buried under practiced smiles. Every drop carried frustration, sadness, longing, all the emotions she never had space to express. Someone reached out to comfort her, but she shook her head. This wasn't about being soothed. This was about release. For once, she wasn't going to swallow her feelings back down or apologize for being too emotional. She was finally letting them out. And as the crying slowed, something unexpected happened. She felt lighter. Weaker, yes, but lighter too. The tears hadn't solved the problems or erased the pain, but they had freed her from the burden of pretending she was unaffected. Sometimes strength wasn't about holding it all in. Sometimes strength was found in the breaking, because only then could the healing begin. This has been the summary of Sister Wife, a memoir of faith, family, and finding freedom by Brown Woolley, summarized by Cellwave Audio and narrated by Callum.